Singapore's Temasek managed the windfall it got from the properties left behind by Singapore's former colonizer, Great Britain.
Process of those who will not receive 100 times as much houses, brothers, sisters, mothers, houses. In today's gospel, Lord, you are quick to remind us of what in today's gospel, Lord, you are quick to remind us of what Christian leadership means and of what it demands. Today, you speak to all of us in the halls of the Senate as you spoke to Peter. In truth, I tell you, there is no one who has left house, brothers, sisters, mother, father, children, or land for my sake and for the sake of the gospel, who will not receive 100 times as much houses, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, and land, and persecutions too, now in this present time, and in the world to come, eternal life. Many who are first will be last, and the last first. We thank you, Lord, for this privilege to serve you by serving our people. Keep us in your grace that we may always remember that you have called us to prioritize you and others above ourselves. It is certainly not an easy battle. Sometimes taking up our cross as well as the crosses of those who depend on us feels like a burden too heavy to bear. But we continue to hold on to your love and mercy, trusting that we can do all things because it is you who strengthens us. We pray, Lord, that you continue to bless the work of our hands and purify the desires of our hearts. Bless our work so that they reflect nothing but your goodness. Purify our hearts so that we desire nothing but to glorify you alone. Fill us with your spirit. Embolden us with the courage to lead by putting ourselves last and putting you first. This we ask in your mighty name. Amen. In the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Before we do the roll call of members, while we're waiting for the minority leader to come down, I'd like to acknowledge the majority leader. I'd just like to quickly acknowledge we have with us a delegation from the Indonesian Senate, led by no other than Dr. Maya Rumantir. She's with us, and Honorable Abdul Hakim is with us as well. Members of the regional representatives, that is our counterparts in Indonesia, and Minister Dodo Sudrajat of the Indonesian Embassy, as well as Minister Councilor Partogi Samusir. We welcome, and her daughter Kiara and her staff, we welcome you to the Senate, our distinguished colleagues in Indonesia. You're very welcome in the Philippine Senate. And thank you for the wonderful song. By the way, she is a wonderful singer, an accomplished singer and former actress. Welcome to the Senate. We suspend session so that we may approach our guests.
Governor Edsel Greco,
Senator Binay, Senator Yan, Senator Go, Senator Ontiveros, Senator Lapid, Senator Legarda, Senator Marcos, Senator Padilla, Senator Pimentel, Senator Poe, Senator Revilla, Senator Tolentino, Senator Tulfo, Senator Villanueva, Senator Villar Cynthia, Senator Villar Mark, the Senate President.
Present. With 22 senators present, the chair declares the presence of a quorum. Majority Leader.
Yes, Mr. President. Mr. President, before we proceed with our agenda today, may I be allowed to recognize some guests from the gallery? Governor Edsel Greco Lagman of Albay, guest of Senator J.V. Ejercito. Congressman Olano Dizon of Mandaue, Cebu. Emery Olano Dizon. Mayor Teresa Alegado of Consolacion, Cebu, guest of Senator Alan Cayetano in this representation. Guest of Senator Gatchalian in this representation. Samar Governor Shari Ann Tan. Samar 1st District Representative Stephen James Tan. Samar 2nd District Representative Reynolds Tan. Baras Catanduanes Mayor Jose Pado Teves. Guest of our dear Senate President, Mayor Rogelio Yeke of San Fernando, Bukidnon, together with Mr. Romero Navaja, Engineer Wiman Lubido, Engineer Luis, Attorney Villegas, and Mr. Dumingsil. Guest of Senator Subiri, Vice Governor Fatima Sinsuat of Maguindanao del Norte, Mayor Datu Lester Sinsuat of Maguindanao del Norte. We also have with us, Mr. President, Mayor Marcos Mamay Nunungan of Lanao del Norte. Guest of this representation, Mr. President, former Mayor of Urdaneta City, Pangasinan, Bobom Perez, with his wife, Miss Nida Perez. They're both here. Guest of Senator Go, Mayor Randy Salamat of Alfonso Cavite, Vice Mayor Mojica Pel. Guest of Senator Tolentino, Governor Edwin Jubahib of Davao del Norte is here. Our good friend is here. And of course, Mr. President, our guests from the executives, we have BSP Governor Felipe Medalla, DBM Secretary Mina Pangandaman. We welcome all of them in this August.
Yes. Welcome to your Senate, ladies and gentlemen. Maraming salamat sa inyong pagbisita dito.
Mr. President, at this juncture, I move that we defer the approval of the journal of the 75th session, Monday, May 29, 2023 at a later hour. So
There
moved.
being no objection to the motion, motion is approved.
Mr. President, I move that we proceed with the reference of business.
There being no objection, we ask the Secretary to read the reference of business.
Bills on first reading, Senate Bill number 2253, an act mandating all government agencies to post and display national symbols and figures to instill Filipino youth awareness and patriotism.
Further Committees on Youth, Civil Service, and Finance.
Senate Bill number 2254, an act enabling the Commission on Elections to establish an automated and online system for voter registration, providing funds therefore and for other purposes by Senator Villar M.
Referred to Committees on Electoral Reforms, Science and Technology, and Finance.
2255, an act to establish a grant program to provide vision care to children by Senator Villar M.
To Committees on Health and Demography and Finance.
2256, an act providing an Amber Alert system to prevent kidnapping of children by Senator Villar M.
Committees on Women and Children, Local Government, and Finance.
2257, an act strengthening the adoption of stray and impounded animals, providing incentives by Senator Villar M.
Committees on Agriculture, Food, Local Government, and Ways and Means.
2258, an act establishing programs and services for the support of the mental health and wellness of teachers, providing funds therefore and for other purposes by Senator Villar M.
Committees on Basic Education, Health and Demography, Finance.
2259, an act promoting awareness for the intellectual property rights of independent artists, establishing programs pursuant thereto, and providing funds therefore by Senator Villar M.
To the Committees on Trade and Commerce, Public Information, and Finance.
2260, an act declaring Ulot River in the municipality of Paranas, province of Samar, an ecotourism destination by Senator Marcos.
To the Committees on Tourism, Environment, Natural Resources, and Finance.
2261, an act converting the Hulu circumferential road in the municipality of Hulu, Sulu, into a national road and appropriating funds therefore by Senator Marcos.
To the Committee on Rules.
2262, an act converting the circumferential road of the 9 island barangays of the municipality of the Paso Rio del Norte, namely Bagacay, Cabawa, Daguhoy, Monserrat, San Miguel, Santa Filomena, Consolacion, San Carlos, and Buenavista into a national road and appropriating funds therefore by Senator Marcos.
To the Committee on Rules.
2263, an act declaring the Mindanao Civic Center complex located in the municipality of Tubod, province of Lanao del Norte, a sports tourism destination and appropriating funds therefore by Senator Marcos.
Committees on Tourism, Sports, and Finance.
2264, an act mandating the Department of Agriculture to establish a national agricultural crop program operating funds therefore and for other purposes by Senator De La Rosa.
To Committees on Agriculture, Food, and Finance.
Resolutions. Proposed Senate Resolution number 640, congratulating and commending the Philippine team and their coaching staff for bringing great pride and honor to the country with their outstanding performance at the 32nd Southeast Asian Games, winning 58 gold, 85 silver, and 107 bronze medals.
To the Committee on
Senator
Rules.
Villanueva. 641, directing the appropriate Senate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the rise of unregistered and unauthorized online lending platforms and the abusive collection and debt recovery practices of online lending companies by Senator Villanueva.
Committees on Banks and Financial Institutions and Currencies.
642, directing the Senate Committee on Tourism to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the impact of natural and man-made disasters on the integrity of the cultural heritage sites in the country in the light of fire incident at the Manila Central Post Office with the end and view of integrating cultural heritage sites conservation into the disaster risk reduction and management plan by Senator Binay.
Committees on Culture and Arts and Tourism.
643, directing the Senate Committee on Women, Children, Family Relations, and Gender Equality to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the cease and desist order issued by the Department of Social Welfare and Development against Gentle Hands Incorporated orphanage that resulted in the pulling out of the wards of GHI from its facility with the end and view of reviewing current policies on orphanages and child residential care facilities in the Philippines to ensure adherence to the best interest of the child by Senator Contiveros.
Committee on Women, Children, Family Relations, and Gender Equality.
644, urging the Senate Committee on Ways and Means to inquire in aid of legislation on the circumstances surrounding the 50 billion tax fraud perpetrated by Renterprise International, Inc. against the Republic of the Philippines with the end and view of laying down stricter measures to safeguard and protect the security of online transactions by Senator Tolentino.
Committee on Ways and Means.
645, directing the appropriate Senate committee to conduct an investigation in aid of legislation on the circumstances which prompted the Department of Social Welfare and Development to issue a cease and desist order against Gentle Hands, Inc. with the end of view of amending or passing laws which will strengthen the special protection granted to children by the 1987 Constitution by Senator Pimentel III.
Committee on Women, Children, and Family Relations.
646, expressing the profound sympathy and sincere condolences of the Senate of the Philippines on the death of Nueva Vizcaya Governor Carlos M. Padilla by Senator Villanueva.
To the Committee on Rules. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, with the permission of the body, I move that we proceed to the Senate President's designation of Senate conferees to the Bicameral Conference Committee on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill number 2212, Regional Specialty Centers Act, and House Bill number 7751, the Department of Health Specialty Centers Act. I so move, Mr. President.
The following members are hereby designated as Senate conferees to the Bicameral Conference Committee on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill number 2212 and House Bill number 7751. They are Senator Christopher Bongo as chairperson of the committee, members Senator Lauren Legarda, Senator Risa Ontiveros on the part of the minority.
Mr. President, may I ask for a minute suspension?
Session suspended for 1 minute.
resume consideration of Senate Bill number 2020 under Committee Report number 58. This is the Maharlika Investment Fund Act of 2023. I so move, Mr. President.
There being no objection, motion is approved.
Mr. President, the parliamentary status of this measure is that at 1 a.m. in the morning today, we close the period of interpellation. And so with the consent of the body, I move to open the period of general debate. I so move, Mr. President.
There being no objection, motion is approved.
Mr. President, with the consent of the body, to deliver his en contra speech, I move to recognize the minority leader, the gentleman from Cagayan de Oro, and Zambales, Senator Aquilino Coco Pimentel.
The gentleman from Cagayan de Oro and Zambales, our distinguished minority floor leader, Senator Aquilino Coco Pimentel, is recognized.
Mr. President, my dear colleagues, thank you for the time you're giving the minority to deliver our turno in contra. Today I rise before this august chamber to deliver my turno in contra on the proposed measure, Senate Bill number 2020, under Committee Report 58, an act establishing the Maharlika Investment Fund, providing for the management, investment, and use of the proceeds of the fund, and for other purposes. Under Section 75, Rule 27 of our rules, it is provided that after the sponsor, subsequent speakers for or against a bill are allowed for debates on bills or other matters, provided that they are not on amendments. The sponsor of this Maharlika bill has finished expressing the contents and purposes of the bill, and now this representation, who is vehemently against this measure, wishes to express his opposition thereto. This measure is otherwise known as the Maharlika Investment Fund of 2023. As minority leader in the Senate, I will not shirk away from my duty to constructively criticize all proposed measures that can adversely affect the future of our nation, which includes the youth, our children, and grandchildren. I am of strong belief that the establishment of the Maharlika Investment Fund is totally unjustified. Forcing it, therefore, presents significant risks and concerns that cannot be ignored. The MIF bill will have far-reaching effects on our economy and the future of our country. The MIF's promised land full of bread, honey, and wine may or may not happen. But what is certain is the MIF will lead us to the road to debt, and more debts, like as if we are not yet swimming in an ocean of debt of more than 13 trillion pesos. What is most certain in the midst of all these uncertainties to be brought about by the creation of the MIF is that the endless road to their promised land will be built with the blood, sweat, and tears in the form of the hard-earned taxes paid by every Filipino. Mr. President and my dear colleagues, before I dwell more into that, I would like to bring to the attention of the body a grave procedural error that this chamber has committed. Having read the final version of the committee report more than once, I am more convinced now that the proper committee where the bill should have been referred to at the very start should have been the Committee on Government Corporations, not the Committee on Banks. We have to correct this, as process is as important as substance. The bill is about the corporate formation of the Maharlika Investment Corporation. Corporate concepts dominate the proposed bill. There is hardly any banking concept that is mentioned in the bill. Under Section 13, Rule 10 of the Senate Rules, the jurisdiction of the Committee on Banks, Financial Institutions, and Currencies are all matters relating to banks, financial institutions, government and private currencies, capital markets, mutual funds, securitization, coinage, and circulation of money. On the other hand, the jurisdiction of the Committee on Government Corporations and Public Enterprises is all questions affecting government corporations, including all amendments to the charters, the interests of the government in the different industrial and commercial enterprises, privatization. The primary intention of the measure is to create a corporate body to be known as the Maharlika Investment Corporation. It does not directly involve matters relating to banks, financial institutions, government and private currencies, capital markets, mutual funds, securitization, coinage, and circulation of money. Its dealing with banks, financial institutions, etc., if at all, is a mere effect or consequence of its corporate purpose or existence. The measure even states that the provisions of Republic Act number 11232 as amended. This is the revised Corporation Code of the Philippines, which are not inconsistent with the measure shall be applicable to the MIC, Mr. President. Corporate matters and principles are well scattered in the bill, and yet the banking concepts are nowhere to be found. This is clearly not a banking measure, but a bill creating a government-owned and controlled corporation. We can still correct this basic mistake by recommitting the committee report not to the committee of origin, but to the correct committee, which is the Committee on Government Corporations and Public Enterprises, for it to conduct further hearing on this subject matter, taking into consideration some of the suggestions which I will be mentioning in this speech. There is also a recent development which is procedurally objectionable, Mr. President, based on our Constitution. The President has just sent to the Senate the presidential certification to the necessity of the immediate enactment of Senate Bill number 2020. This is based on the power of the President. This is based on the power granted to the President under Article 6, Section 26, Paragraph 2 of the 1987 Constitution, which reads as follows. No bill passed by either house shall become a law unless it has passed 3 readings on separate days, and printed copies thereof in its final form have been distributed to its members 3 days before its passage, except when the President certifies to the necessity of its immediate enactment to meet a public calamity or emergency. This has been a much abused power by the office of the President. The office of the President has even certified the national budget for year 2023, an act a law which we consider and pass year in and year out at predictable periods of the year. And here we are again, facing a presidential certification of necessity or urgency when there is actually no public calamity or emergency right before our very eyes, which could be addressed by the Maharlika Bill. How could a fund with promised benefits to be felt 10 to 20 years from now be the answer to an existing public calamity or emergency? That is a question that this representation would want to be answered, Mr. President. The existence of a public calamity or emergency is a constitutional requirement that should be taken seriously. If it is not present, then there should be no ground for a presidential certification. I therefore urge the Senate to set aside the presidential certification for the Maharlika Bill, for it is unconstitutional. Our 3 readings for this bill must be on 3 separate days in accordance with the Constitution. Under the measure being considered, the Maharlika Investment Fund will swiftly take 75 billion pesos from so-called investable funds, which are public funds and or deposit liabilities. And later on, it can come back for more to complete the 500 billion pesos capitalization. This MIF can be insatiable, Mr. President. And we have even given its board the power to increase the authorized capital stock, thereby allowing it to amend the law through executive or administrative action. This cannot be done, my dear colleagues. Mr. President, whose idea was the Maharlika Investment Fund? The origin of the MIF remains a mystery to us, to me. It was never mentioned during the presidential campaign, not in the SONA, and not even in the medium-term fiscal framework presentation, Mr. President. It was not even in the initial LIDAC list. So the most logical question to ask is, saan ba nanggaling ito? Is it possible that we are doing this as a favor to a businessman who has access to the ears of the powers that be, whose business or bottom line has been hit by the downturn in the world economy and thus would need a new client? We will hopefully know the identity of this big-time influencer in due time. So where did this idea really come from? We have to start by examining the original versions filed, Mr. President. Our earliest bill is House Bill number 6398. The salient features of this bill are: the fund shall be sourced from the investable funds of the country's top-performing GFIs and from contributions of the national government. The funds invested by the GFI shall be exempt from any regulatory restrictions if invested solely to the MIF. The funding sources shall be the GSIS to the tune of 125 billion pesos, the SSS to the tune of 50 billion pesos, LBP, which is the Land Bank of the Philippines, 50 billion pesos, DBP, the Development Bank of the Philippines, 25 billion pesos, the national government, 25 billion pesos, BSP, our Banco Central, 10% of foreign currency remittances of OFWs, and 10% of annual contributions of the business process outsourcing sector. The General or Supplemental Appropriations Act can also be a source of funding, and other sources like special assessments on natural resources, public borrowings, etc. The administrative and operational expenses is allowed to be 10% of the gross revenue of the immediately preceding year or its initial capitalization for the first year's expenses. The chairperson and the CEO and the members of the board shall be entitled to honoraria and reasonable allowances and or per diem for each meeting actually attended and shall be reimbursed for actual and reasonable expenses incurred in the performance of their duties. The board of directors, officials, employees, and staff of the MIC shall be entitled to honoraria, performance bonus, or any similar performance-based compensation as may be determined by the board based on their sound judgment, taking into consideration, among others, the performance of the fund, the performance of the individual employee or officer, and industry standards and practices. The MIC is exempted from RA 10149, the GOCC Governance Act of 2011, and from any and all forms and kinds of direct and indirect taxes, including output and input value-added taxes, and documentary stamp taxes, assessments, fees, charges, customs, or import duty or duties imposed by the national or local government. The MIF investments transaction shall be exempt from the provisions of RA 9184, which is the Government Procurement Act, and RA 10667, the Philippine Competition Act. The officers and employees of the MIC shall be exempt from civil service laws, rules, and regulations. They shall likewise be exempt from the provisions of RA 6758, the Salary Standardization Act, and succeeding laws on salary standardization. The distribution of net profits shall be, the MIC, on the distribution of net profits, the MIC shall be exempt from RA 7656, the Dividends Law of 1994. The Board of Directors shall have the discretion on how much shall be distributed as profits for each of the GFIs and how much thereof shall be carried to the surplus. In appropriations, the amount of 25 billion pesos was appropriated in that original bill to cover the initial contribution of the national government to the MIC, to be sourced from funds actually available as certified by the National Treasurer. Then followed House Bill number 6608. Under this bill, capitalization and funding, LBP 50 billion pesos, DBP 25 billion pesos. However, the founding GFI shall be entitled to prudential and other regulatory reliefs as may be determined by the BSP to promote the financial soundness of these financial institutions while contributing to the overall objective of the MIF. The security or debt instruments issued by the MIC to GFI shall be guaranteed by the national government. Other GFIs and GOCCs may be authorized to contribute to the MIF. Subsequent annual contributions to the MIF shall be as follows. BSP shall remit 100% of its dividends for the first 2 years. Then BSP remits 50% to MIF and 50% to the national government to fund the increase in the BSP's capitalization. Thereafter, after completion of the BSP's capitalization, 100% of its dividends shall be remitted to the MIF. 10% of gross gaming revenue streams created after the effectivity of this act shall also be contributed by PAGCOR. Other sources such as royalties and or special assessments on natural resources based on the fiscal regime to be implemented by the national government, proceeds from privatization of government assets, and borrowings by the MIF. Administrative and operational expenses to be allowed is 2% of the funds managed. For the initial year, it is 2% of its initial capitalization. On rewards and incentives, the officials, employees, and staff of the MIC shall be entitled to honoraria, performance bonus, or any similar performance-based compensation as may be determined by the board and as approved by the President of the Philippines, taking into consideration, among others, the performance of the fund, the performance of the individual employee or officer, and industry standards and practices. On exemptions from the GOCC Governance Act of 2011, tax exemptions from local and national taxes, direct and indirect, imposed by the Local Government Code, the National Internal Revenue Code, etc. Importation of supplies and equipment by the MIC shall be exempt from customs duties under the Customs Modernization and Tariff Act, RA 10863. There's also an exemption from the Government Procurement Reform Act, or RA 9184, and from the Salary Standardization Act, RA 6758. On the distribution of net profits, 25% of the net profit shall be directly distributed in the form of poverty subsistence subsidies to families falling below the poverty threshold. The remainder shall be remitted to the national government to be earmarked for social welfare programs and projects, excluding infrastructure projects. It is worthwhile to note that there is no distribution of net profits to any other GFI or private investor in that said second House bill. The initial bill in the House, and even the one filed in the Senate, all call the Maharlika Fund a Sovereign Wealth Fund, SWF, directly in the explanatory note or indirectly by retaining the section entitled Compliance with Santiago Principles. However, it is clear that the Maharlika Fund is not a sovereign wealth fund or no longer an SWF in the current version. Let us trace the story and the history of the early real SWFs, Mr. President. Sovereign wealth funds are defined by the International Federation of Sovereign Wealth Funds, that is the IFSWF, as special purpose investment funds or arrangements owned by the general government, created by the general government for macroeconomic purposes. SWFs hold, manage, or administer assets to achieve financial objectives and employ a set of investment strategies which include investing in foreign financial assets. So where does the money for SWFs come from in the first place? Budget surplus, trade surplus, or other sources of revenue like a high price for a commodity or a natural resource. Oil-rich countries like Norway, Russia, and many in the Middle East have put up their SWF from their money from oil sales. The first country in the world to establish an SWF in modern times is Kuwait, which established its fund in 1953, right after they discovered oil. So they invested their excess oil revenues. Abu Dhabi funds and Saudi Arabia funds also established an SWF backed up by their oil wealth and oil sales. Norway struck oil in its exclusive economic zone in the Ekofisk field in 1969. It took Norway some time to come up with the idea of an SWF to address some of the problems it encountered with its sudden oil wealth. It took Norway around 12 years of discussion before establishing its SWF. All political parties agreed to its formation. The Norway SWF is supervised by the central bank, and the parliament supervises the choice of the managers. The fund invests very conservatively and only outside of Norway. If there is a gold standard in sovereign wealth funds, then it is Norway's sovereign wealth fund. Mr. President and my dear colleagues in the Senate, I am not asking for 12 years to discuss the Maharlika Fund. That might be too long. But definitely such a divisive, incomplete, and unjustified idea needs more than 12 days, 12 weeks, or even 12 months of discussion. Time for discussion, not mere time that it is pending. Magkaiba po yan. Also, all political parties and the sectors of our society must be consulted and must be heard. We are not looking for unanimity in the decision-making process. All we want is inclusivity in the process itself. Also, it might be wise to subject this bill, should it become a law, to a referendum for approval or rejection by the Filipino people. China, Hong Kong, and Singapore also have SWFs, but they got their funding from their excess reserves from the Asian export boom because they exported more than they imported. In short, they had and they continue to have surplus, they have trade surpluses. Singapore's Temasek managed the windfall it got from the properties left behind by Singapore's former colonizer, Great Britain. In the United States, the state of Alaska has the permanent fund, which was created in the 1970s when they struck oil, which led to a significant increase in their revenue. Chile's SWF is funded by the sale of mineral resources, primarily of copper, as Chile is the world's largest copper producer. Botswana's SWF is backed up by the sale of diamonds. Some are arguing that the concept of an SWF has evolved, and that countries without budget surplus, without trade surplus, without windfall earnings from the fortuitous discovery of an important commodity have or can put up their own SWF. Since there is no surplus, these evolved SWFs most likely got their funding from debts. Debts, D-E-B-T-S, Mr. President, utang. One famous evolved SWF is Malaysia's 1MDB. This SWF lost an estimated $4.5 billion but is still remembered for a Hollywood movie that it produced, The Wolf of Wall Street, which is a nice movie, ironically about financial fraud. $4.5 billion lost by the Malaysian people, one movie gained by Hollywood. And they raised their capital through bonds, or in plain language, debt. The person who uses political connections in order to run one MDB is still at large and is reported to have already left Malaysia and is in hiding. The political big boss who ran the one MDB show was found guilty on multiple charges of corruption and money laundering. Truth be told, Mr. President, during my breaks from studying this Maharlika proposal, I watched that movie, The Wolf of Wall Street. In the movie, which was based on the story of a true-to-life financial criminal, swindler, and scammer, we see this scammer enjoying a lavish lifestyle involving fancy cars, yachts, helicopters, apartments in New York, bank accounts in Switzerland, and $26,000 dinners, all funded by stolen other people's money. In real life, concerning 1MDB, the brains behind 1MDB also enjoyed that lavish lifestyle I just mentioned. Parties galore, fancy cars, yachts, helicopters, hotels in LA, in Los Angeles, USA, apartments in New York, bank accounts all over the world. If the Wolf of Wall Street enjoyed $26,000 dinners, the brains behind 1MDB enjoyed $25,000 bottles of champagne. Yan lang po yung kaibahan nila na nakita ko. Kinawawa ng 1MDB ang Malaysia. Pero dito sa Pilipinas, parang gusto pa nating gumaya at magkaroon ng sarili nating 1MDB. Anong klaseng laro itong linalaro natin, mga kababayan? With no surplus from oil discovery or from trade activities and no windfall profit of any kind, the Philippines has no justifiable reason to form and enter into the world of sovereign wealth funds and even investment funds. It is very obvious from the above-mentioned list of nations that established SWFs that they funded them through budget surplus, trade surplus, and income from in-demand commodities such as oil. The Philippines has no surplus, budget, or trade. Our perennial budget deficit is proof that we do not have a budget surplus. Our trade in goods deficit is around $40 to $60 billion a year. Our favorable trade in services balance is not enough to offset the massive trade in goods deficit. According to the Senate Economic Planning Office, our CEPO, our country has been in a perennial budget deficit. The only exception were the years 1994 to 1997 during the administration of President Fidel Ramos. But these were not significant budget surpluses. In the past 10 years, the average annual fiscal deficit amounted to 652.7 billion pesos, or an average fiscal deficit to GDP ratio of 3.6%. To date, the highest deficit to GDP ratio was incurred in 2021, equivalent to 8.6%, no doubt made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic. Hence, the running average must now be greater than the 3.6 I mentioned. Further, we have difficulty balancing our budget because our total revenue, both tax and non-tax, cannot answer for our expenditures. For example, in 2022, revenue was just in the amount of 3.5 trillion pesos, while the budget authorized expenditures in the amount of 5.02 trillion pesos. In addition to budget deficit is our trade deficit, which was recorded at $58.3 billion for 2022, which was more than double the $24.6 billion recorded in 2020. It is not only our debt which is doubling, our trade deficit is too. All of these deficits lead or force us to borrow. Our national debt now stands at 13.75 trillion pesos as of end February 2023. This means that each Filipino already has a debt in the amount of 120,000 pesos, even the newborn. Under the Maharlika measure, we give the MIC the power to incur debt. In short, we want to authorize another entity to incur debt in the name of the Filipino people para hindi pa tayo nagsawang umutang. Mr. President, the national government debt to GDP ratio is an indicator of a country's economic health and its ability to repay its debt. Last year, it was reported that we have a national government debt to GDP ratio of 62.1%. It now surpasses the 60% threshold considered as manageable by multilateral lenders for developing countries. In fact, the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, the PIDS, estimated our debt to GDP ratio to peak as high as 66.8% by 2023 and 2024 before falling to 65.7% by 2026. This is an indication that we are not actually near the target of less than 60% by 2025. With these figures, data, and metrics in mind, we see that our country is now at greater risk of defaulting on its debt. And yet here we are, wanting to establish a Maharlika Investment Corporation with the power to incur more debt. The road to hell is filled with good intentions, including this knowingly contracted unnecessary debt. While we are a country blessed with abundant natural resources, our natural resources remain undeveloped. It is important to note that the Maharlika Bill does not categorically and explicitly impose or even suggest any revenue-generating measure on mining and the extraction and exploitation of our God-given natural resources. So the intriguing question is, why? The 75 billion pesos taken from Land Bank and the DBP are not new money, new wealth or surplus funds with a still unknown role in public financing. These are part of so-called investable funds already in the possession, balance sheets, and financial statements of these banks. Nababagalan lang daw tayo sa kanilang paggamit sa mga pondong ito. We criticize them for not being bolder risk takers. But if their charters and the BSP regulations prevent them from doing this, then why aren't we calling for the amendment of these regulations and give them more leeway or elbow room? The solution being proposed is to create an entirely new entity and hire new people to gamble the funds which the LBP and the DBP are prohibited from gambling with. I have therefore a very fundamental policy question. Should we allow the left hand to do what the right hand cannot do? Mr. President, the sponsor mentioned several countries already having a sovereign wealth fund. In particular, he mentioned Indonesia. We had some guests earlier. With the Indonesia Investment Authority, ang acronym po nito is INA, that it is often cited as the ideal model for the Philippines. We formerly used the Norwegian model, but then all of a sudden we turned to the INA. However, the INA was established only in 2021, so it is quite early to say if it will be successful or if it is already a successful sovereign wealth fund or investment fund, Mr. President. At any rate, if INA is indeed the Philippines' latest model, why did we not pattern our MIF after INA? So let us compare the MIF to the INA. INA is wholly owned by the government of Indonesia. Maharlika Investment Corporation, on the other hand, refers to or is a government or controlled corporation to be created under this act, which may not be wholly owned by the Philippine government, Mr. President. More importantly, in terms of the governance boards, INA's board of directors is formed by the supervisory board chosen from finance professionals. Headhunters and investors were consulted in the selection, and there is a management contract between the supervisory board and the board of directors. On the other hand, our MIF has no supervisory board that controls the board of directors. We only have a passive advisory board which cannot do any management or nor control functions. Not to mention that the members of our board of directors are primarily political appointees. And I have observed INA seeks credibility by adherence to laws and global best practices, while our MIF seeks exemptions from our laws. The proposed Maharlika Investment Fund bill also diverts attention and resources away from addressing more pressing socio-economic issues that our nation faces today. Our country faces numerous challenges and problems. Allow me to mention some of them. Poverty, our food production, education crisis, healthcare deficiencies, the expensive cost of energy, inflation, injustice, joblessness, crime, and corruption, among many others. Instead of channeling our efforts and funds into a large investment fund, we should prioritize addressing these urgent issues that directly impact the well-being of our citizens and the future of our country. Our full year 2022 average inflation rate is at 5.8%, higher than the 3.9 posted the year before. According to CEPO, while the acceleration of inflation is evident across many countries, the Philippines posted the highest inflation rate among the ASEAN member countries. The most obvious impact of a high inflation rate is that we have and our people have less purchasing power. What does less purchasing power mean to the 20 million poor Filipinos? They will have to make very difficult choices every day on which of their needs they will have to prioritize. What is this government's answer to the problem of inflation? I have not heard a concrete, sensible one. According to the PSA, the poverty incidence in the Philippines was 18.1% in 2021. What's the meaning of this? It means that there are at least 20 million poor Filipinos who cannot meet their basic food and non-food needs. They live below the poverty threshold income of about 12,030 pesos per month for a family of 5. Yes, Mr. President, you heard me correctly. That translates to a daily budget of 401 pesos for the entire family. Kasama na dyan ang gastos para pagkain, tubig, damit, kuryente, renta sa bahay, gamot, edukasyon, transportasyon at iba pa. As of the moment, many Filipinos are losing their jobs or are experiencing a decline in income. Many businesses are closing. Aside from ayuda, what is this government's answer to widespread poverty? We should ask the same questions for all of the other problems, and we should start demanding answers. Let us not be distracted by this Maharlika Investment Fund. The MIF will only lead us to more debt, more misery, and hopefully not more corruption scandals. Sad to say, Mr. President, my dear colleagues, I get the impression that the solution of the government towards our long-term goals of reducing poverty and raising the quality of life for all Filipinos is the creation of this Maharlika Investment Fund. It is presented as if it is a necessity. This is not the solution, Mr. President. The proposed measure is not the right investment that will give our economy the momentum to zoom forward. This is not even in the right direction. The argument against the MIF can be captured by this statement of one of our constituents. Ipambibili mo na lang ng pagkain, isusugal mo pa. Before we do that, isugal kung anumang kakarampot na meron tayo, let us please consider the following events or misfortunes that transpired recently. The gold standard of SWS, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, lost 1.6 trillion Norwegian kroner or $164 billion for the whole of 2022. You see, even the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, considered to be one of the best run, is also suffering from the bad situation or condition of the world economy. The loss is B as in billions, and that dollar sign is the US dollar. So at 55 pesos to a dollar, to a US dollar, this loss of the Norwegian SWF is in the amount of 9 trillion pesos. These are very difficult times nowadays, Mr. President. Not less than 3 US banks have failed recently. First Republic Bank, Silicon Valley Bank, and Signature Bank. And the contagion reached the banking safe haven of Switzerland, leading to the collapse of Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse was founded in 1856 to finance the expansion of the Swiss railway system. Through the years, Credit Suisse played an important role in the economic development of Switzerland. However, in recent years, Credit Suisse has faced several controversies, scandals, and questionable decisions that made investors and depositors lose confidence and eventually led to substantial withdrawals of their deposits. What is the lesson here? The collapse of Swiss banking legend, Credit Suisse, in March 2023 is a testament to the reality that during these difficult economic times, no bank, no business is immune to financial difficulties, crisis, and collapse. This is the reason why we should be very concerned that our banks, the LBP, DBP, and BSP, are involved in the creation and capitalization of this Maharlika Investment Fund. Let us be very afraid of this banking contagion, especially if the MIF fails. We are therefore subjecting our banking system to an unnecessary systemic risk. In addition, the world has been made very unpredictable by geopolitical tensions like the Russia-Ukraine shooting war and the China-Taiwan-USA brinkmanship. In short, the present world economy is not good for investing. Actually, we can say that the present world economic situation is not good at all. Our world economy has been under enormous pressure for the past few years. Several major countries are now struggling with high inflation rate, increasing debt burden, war in Europe, rising geopolitical tensions. The COVID-19 pandemic has only worsened the situation. According to global economic prospects, the United States, the Euro area, and China are all undergoing a period of pronounced weakness, and the resulting spillovers are exacerbating other headwinds faced by emerging market and developing economies. The combination of slow growth, tightening financial conditions, and heavy indebtedness is likely to weaken investment and trigger corporate defaults. Further negative shocks, such as higher inflation, even tighter monetary policy, financial stress, deeper weakness in major economies, or rising geopolitical tensions could push the global economy into recession. So what are these global events telling us? We need to avoid making hasty decisions that could have long-term consequences. Allow me to quote Nikolai Tangen, the CEO of Norway's SWF, the gold standard of SWFs. He said this: "We had 25 good years, but I think the next 10 will be very different. I think it will be much, much more difficult to generate returns in the next 10 years." And he said that in an interview just a few months ago. Wala ka ng surplus, gusto mo pang umutang para maka-invest ka sa panahong napakahirap kumita at ang daming negosyong nagsasara sa pagkalugi. Given the present world economy, it will be very challenging for our government to allocate funds towards this Maharlika Investment Fund. In the 2023 national budget, with the overarching objective of economic transformation, this administration's agenda is focused on the following goals: 6.5 to 8% real GDP growth annually between 2023 to 2028, 9% or single-digit poverty rate by 2028, less than 3% national government deficit to GDP ratio by 2028, less than 60% national government debt to GDP ratio by 2025, and at least $4,256 gross national income per capita. These are the measurable medium-term macroeconomic fiscal objective in this administration's medium-term fiscal framework. If you can recall, during our deliberations on the MTFF, the Committee on Finance reported the following data about our economy and our budget. In 2021, the real GDP growth was 5.7%. In 2021, the poverty rate was 18.1%. The national government deficit to GDP ratio was 6.5%. The national government debt to the national government deficit to GDP ratio was 6.5%. The national government debt to GDP ratio was 62.1%. And the GNI per capita was $3,643. These macroeconomic indicators do not indicate wealth. They do not give us the confidence and should not give us the bravado to establish this kind of fund, this Maharlika Investment Fund. There must at least be some kind of economic viability to sustain it. A surplus would be a better indicator of our readiness. In the President's certification, which I have alluded to earlier, he stated the need for a sustainable national investment fund. The Maharlika Investment Fund, which has no surplus, no windfall, no revenue-generating asset underlying it, is not and cannot be that sustainable national investment fund. Since I have mentioned economic viability, allow me to adopt as my own argument the argument provided by Senator Chis Escudero. He cited Article 12 Section 16 of our Constitution, which reads as follows. Government-owned or controlled corporations may be created or established by special charters in the interest of the common good and subject to the test of economic viability. The Supreme Court, in the case of City of Lapu-Lapu versus Philippine Economic Zone Authority, mentioned the purpose of this test as explained by Commissioner Blas of Ople, the proponent of this test of economic viability. The decision quotes Mr. Ople as follows. We know what happened in the past. If a government corporation loses, then it makes its claim upon the taxpayers' money through new equity infusions from the government. And what is always invoked is the common good. Therefore, when we insert the phrase economic viability together with the common good, this becomes a restraint on future enthusiasts for state capitalism to excuse themselves from the responsibility of meeting the market test so that they become viable. So, Mr. President, in relation to this argument, we have to ask the following questions. Is the Maharlika Investment Corporation created in the interest of the common good? Does the Maharlika Investment Corporation satisfy the test of economic viability? Where is that test? Where is the result of the test of economic viability for the super GOCC, the Maharlika Investment Corporation? This is a constitutional requirement, and in this case, this test presents a so-called prejudicial question, meaning we have to answer this question first before we can proceed with the bill that we are considering. Is the super GOCC Maharlika Investment Corporation an economically viable enterprise or activity? The creation of a sovereign wealth fund without a surplus can create a false sense of security. We are forcing ourselves to believe that we have a cushion against economic instability, when in reality, we may be putting our economy at risk. It is said that the expected return of the Maharlika Investment Fund is estimated to be at 8.6% on average. I do not know the formula used in arriving at such a positively brave estimate. But what if the investments made by the Maharlika Investment Fund do not perform as expected? Our country could and would be left in a worse financial position than if the fund had not been created in the first place. Dagdag deficit lang. And let me add, deficit equals debt. Kaya dagdag utang lang ang ending. It will be very unfortunate if our country stubbornly puts up an SWF or any kind of state-initiated investment fund, which is not based on surplus of funds, windfall profits, or even on a revenue-generating underlying asset. For the government will then be forced to borrow money or raise taxes to fund the investments in this fund, in this SWF. This will be the road to perdition, not to paradise here on earth. Our history is replete with corruption scandals. This does not augur well for the creation of an entity of this magnitude, enjoying all the powers and privileges that we have never seen before granted to a GOCC. With MIF, we run the risk of concentrating a large sum of public money in the hands of a few who will manage the funds. Such a scenario could potentially lead to all kinds of misuse and abuse, as our history shows us. Our country has been in a constant struggle against corruption. In the Global Corruption Index 2022, the Philippines ranked 105th out of 196 countries and territories. The higher the rank, the more corrupt. It even mentioned that financial aid programs during the pandemic created opportunities for corruption and bribery. Nakakalungkot, pero dito sa Pilipinas, ang kahirapan ng taong bayan pinagsasamantalahan pa at pinagkikitaan. We should be conscious that the attempt here is to create a super GOCC, and the original intention was to pack this super GOCC with all the available tax exemptions and exemptions from every and all forms of regulation, and to grant it with an overabundance of privileges. With such a super all-powerful GOCC, great financial crimes wouldn't be far away. Since the MIC can invest in the domestic market, it can therefore choose the winners and losers among our domestic industries, enterprises, and business people. Hence, the MIC can accept, since the MIC can accept capital and investments from domestic private institutions and corporations, it can therefore practically be partnered or married for life to a moneyed domestic corporation. I say moneyed dahil wala namang mahirap na Pilipino na pwedeng mag-partner sa kapital ng Maharlika. Under Section 14, Paragraph J, the MIC Board can also authorize other investments as may be approved by the Board. Add to this the third paragraph of Section 8 on corporate powers, which reads, the MIC may compromise or release in whole or in part any claim of or settled liability to the MIC, regardless of the amount involved, under such terms and conditions as may be prescribed by the Board upon favorable recommendation of the Advisory Board to protect the interests of the MIC and the integrity of the MIF. Reading these two sections together, I worry that crony capitalism is about to rear its evil, ugly head again. Crony capitalism is evil because it is immoral, unfair, wasteful, it does not consider the general welfare, and it distorts the broader economy. Allow me to quote Andrew Jackson, a former US president. There are no necessary evils in government. Its evils exist only in its abuses. If it would confine itself to equal protection, and as heaven does its rain, shower its favors alike on the high and on the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified